Hello and welcome to Liam's Livestream, everyone. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himvar, and today I have a special guest to make a short video with me real quick. This is Christopher Ruocchio over here. He's he's been on the channel before, actually. We chatted before, but he's the author of the Sun Eater but also a fan of short stories, which is...
Yeah, I've actually edited, gosh, I think 8 short story anthologies because I used to work for Baen Books, right? And some of those were like reprint collections, older stories, and some of them were new. So it's been a part of my sort of career that I haven't really gotten to talk about much. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We were just going to go over basically recommending some short stories that we thought, other people might enjoy because we enjoyed them. I feel like personally short stories aren't talked about a lot. In this day and age, it's not the age of pulps so much anymore, or really big anthologies are not that popular. They're kind of popular in the indie scene, and Baen does do those anthologies, which are pretty good. But I can't think of any other bigger publisher doing them much.
They're still around. You get like year's bests and things like that. I remember Titan did a series called like Infinite Stars or something that had a whole bunch of the like bigger space opera names in it. Like everybody from like I think there was a Dune story in it that Kevin J. Anderson did, and there was like an Enderverse thing from Card, and it was all the way down the list. I think there's an Honorverse story in there as well. David Weber. It was a lot of like bigger names. So they're still around. But you're right? Like for the longest time, the short story was like the format for science fiction and fantasy. It was like really where writers would cut their teeth. It was possible once upon a time, right, to actually have a career just writing short stories, right, and to live off of it, right. That's how like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, survived, right. Survived being the operative word, especially in Lovecraft's case. They were able to at least subsist off of their writing, just doing short stories, in the 20s and 30s, and that really continued until about the 60s with the new wave, and things started to really change.
Mm-hmm.
And now, like almost nobody reads short stories, right? This sort of a thing in publishing is everybody wants to write a short story, right? Because being in an anthology with your friends is cool, and like getting your friends to write in an anthology, especially if you can get them to write in your world, right, is awesome. But those books don't sell, right, because people are reading novels, and so the short stories just sort of disappeared from like the sort of public consciousness, right, within fandom, capital F fandom. There's still some awards that will recognize them, like the Hugo still does a short story award. But when the Dragon Award started a few years ago, they didn't even have a short story category. I still don't think they do, and I think that's a reflection of sort of the change, and that's sad, right? Because they are fun and they're very different than novels. So yeah, it'll be cool to do a little bit of a list here.
Yeah. I think it'll be fun. But yeah, you have good points, and you have the experience, I feel like, of that being in the industry, and because the anthologies you do or did, I think there's still one more coming out, right?
There's one more,
yeah. That some of them were like mostly new, and then other ones were like older, like out of print stuff, or a mix. It seems like so.
Yeah, it was about half and half. I think it was 4 that was all originals, and it was 4 that was mostly reprints. They let me write a story for each of them, right? And obviously, I didn't have anything to reprint, so there were a couple new stories in those. But by and large, those reprints, I worked with a guy named Hank Davis, who had been working with Baen for decades, right? And Hank has a like almost like photographic memory for what was printed in analog and Asimovs and stuff like that. You could ask Hank what the cover story was in analog in like 62, right? February of 62, and he could tell you with like a really high level of reliability, or at least tell you where in the office it was and which shelf to go grab it from. And so we would go into those projects, and he'd have a list of like 30 stories that were on topic, right? Because he started with a theme, right? We did one like Time Troopers was the last one Hank and I did. It was all about military time travel stories, right? So we had this big list, and he would try to find obscure ones. If you could find a Poul Anderson story that had never been reprinted, we would reprint it, right? And so that was a really cool part of all of that, was to dig up these sort of overlooked stories, and to bring them back into new life.
That's appreciated personally. But you're definitely right on like I read a lot of like or recently past couple of years I've read a lot of like older stuff, and even when you do read like novels from the 50s or 60s or 70s, not much so much afterwards, but a little bit in the 80s and stuff. There'll be fix-ups, right? So they're just stuff that had been published generally previously and just combined to make a more cohesive story and novel. Sometimes they're not even very cohesive, but like it's a
Yeah, there's a
novel,
lot of that.
So, but like even the old Elric stuff, since Elric's somewhat more popular right now, I mean those are fix-ups. I mean basically, so.
Yeah. Oh, totally. There was a lot of that going on. A lot of the stories that went into those old ace doubles were totally just, were fix ups, or they would take a story and expand it. Right. Dune originally was serialized. It appeared in 3 issues of Analog in '63 before it was ever a novel.
Yeah.
I've actually got the original on the wall. I have a copy of those Analog books, and I've got one framed over there.
Heck, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I've looked at those before. They're generally not very cheap. The ones I've
Yeah,
looked at. But...
actually it was a gift.
Oh,
I
nice.
I helped index a lot of the collection that we had at the office, and that was something the collector that helped me that I helped get rid of a lot of the stuff from our office gave that to me as a thank you, which was really cool. Kurt, if you're watching, you're the man. But yeah, so yeah, it's there a lot of those stories ended up sort of transitioning into the novel space too, right? Which was a part of the sort of evolving field, right? And it's weird, right? Because we very rarely talk about the history of science fiction as a genre or an art form, right? I think that fandom has by and large been a very poor custodian of its own history, and so there are a lot of people who really think that science fiction started like with Asimov, right? Which is like not true. And it's not even close. Or they'll have even weirder opinions, but like the fact that this sort of thing happened, right? Like this transition into novels and away from short stories is something I think most readers today are largely asleep to. So it's not to repeat myself, but so it'll be fun to sort of look at some of these older stories and even some new ones, right? And just sort of point that lamp at them. So
Yeah. So I think I'm almost certainly these are mostly going to be older stories. If I just go based off what we had already previously talked about. But how about like I share one and you share one, and then we'll just
sounds
bounce
like
back
a
and
plan.
forth. So I'm gonna just go ahead and start if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
And so I have one. Yeah, okay. This is my show, guys. I paid Christopher to come on here with buying a Sun Eater T-shirt. I'm just joking.
Nice.
He's just kind enough to come on. No, but it is a nice shirt though. Actually, it's very comfortable. And it looks good, of course too. But actually, I want a more recent one. So I wanted to kind of like in this case, I was like, it's not really a pulp, but it's like kind of is, right? Because it's Dragon Magazine. This is issue 277. So I think this is from 2000. So right around when third edition came out for D&D fans out there. And this has one piece of fiction in it, which is what I wanted to talk about. And that is, Another Name for Dawn by Paul S. Kemp. So it is kind of in the vein of Sword and Sorcery, which is probably why I'm a big fan of it. D&D is, a mix of things, right? Like, like the Tolkien races often, the Vancian magic, Sword and Sorcery types of stories in a lot of cases. And this is actually the origin story for a character named Erebus Kale. It's about his growing up kind of in the city of Westgate, which is in his gang life there. He's in a gang. He's supposed to kill someone basically and take their money. Doesn't quite go to plan. And it's pretty interesting because Erebus as a character is actually a linguist, which is weird. So like that's not a combination I don't know if I've ever seen before besides reading this. So there are actually like 8 novels about Erebus Kale.
I was going to ask, did he go on to be in?
Yeah. So this actually wasn't I don't think this was the first story. I think the first novel came out and then this short story appeared. You can actually read it online, so you don't have to get this issue of Dragon Magazine. But it's pretty interesting because it's basically his character's origins. His name isn't even Erebus Kale, actually. Like, that's a fake name he uses so he can hide, essentially. So that's basically what the story's about. And I just thought that would be a good, fun one to start with, since, Dragon Magazine, if you even go back to like the earliest issues of Dragon Magazine, like there's a Dragon Magazine, like issue 18 famously has like one of the only stories by Harry Otto Fisher about the Grey Mouser. And in the first page, actually, it says that Dragon magazine of sword and sorcery, and which is pretty interesting because it's really not the case nowadays. In fact, Dragon Magazine doesn't really exist. Dragon Plus is a thing, but they publish fiction like once every 2 years in it. So pretty sad.
Is it mostly gaming now, or?
Yeah, it's mostly like, oh, here's a free map for your 5th edition thing, and like maybe a small adventure for whatever is more recent. I try to get the guy who's in charge of it on Twitter, like annoy him on Twitter to like, hey, put more fiction, like type of thing. But no responses really as of yet. So
yeah, well, you give it time. You gotta wear them down.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Who's the author though? I missed the name.
It's Paul S. Kemp. So he's I don't. Do I have any right here? I have a bunch of Forgotten Realms novels right here. I don't think I have one right here by him. But the first book is Shadow's Witness. That's the first Erebus Kale novel. He also writes some short stories and like anthologies for the Forgotten Realms. He also has his own. I think he might write some Star Wars novels too, but I might be wrong on that. But like, I think he also writes his own. It used to be right here next to In the Palace, Shadow and Joy, but it's not right now. And it's his Sword and Sorcery series he wrote after the Erebus Kale stuff, and it's called something. But the first story is The Hammer and the Blade. I know that. I don't remember what it's like a Fafnir and Grey Master thing. It's a duo.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But that's a fun way to go.
Yeah. So another name for Dawn. It's rather thoughtful. I feel like it's really dark. It's like dark fantasy, just bluntly, I guess. But it's also I don't know. Erebus Kale is a rather thoughtful character. Like, he talks about philosophy sometimes. It's made up philosophy, like dwarvish philosophy or something, and stuff like that. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So do they end up doing a collection of the stories too alongside the novels, or you have to get the magazine to read it? Because
it might be in. I wouldn't be surprised if there is an omnibus for the Erebus Kale trilogy. I think it might be in there. There are other short stories like "And All the Sinner's Saints" is another one he did for the same character, and I don't remember. There's other ones. So, but they're generally spread like in Dragon Magazine. I have a couple of his in Dragon Magazine issues, and then some other anthologies. So, but I think actually most of the short stories you can actually read on his website. So,
that's awesome. Yeah, because that's another thing that's changing too, right? Is a lot of these, especially with like an author's like obscure backlist, they'll put them up, on their website for free, or they'll make them, free Kindle downloads or something like that, right? And that's an interesting sort of development in the history of the format too, right? Is sort of using these stories as like book support, right? Which is kind of what I do with mine, right? I've got these ebook collections I put out, repackaging my own stories, just to give readers something while they wait for the next book. Because of course, as an author, right, you can realistically, if you're writing, 150, 200,000 word novel, you can maybe give them 2 a year, but like, that's a lot different than a subscription, right? Where you're getting multiple videos a week, right? You gotta keep everybody entertained somehow. So that's really cool. I guess if I'm going to do maybe we'll go backwards in time or something like that. I think the most recent story that I've got is The Bible Repairman by Tim Powers, who I was just shilling over on Mike's stream yesterday. He's probably my favorite living fantasy writer. It's like him and Guy Gavriel Kay are like neck and neck. But like Tim is sort of an inheritor of the like Weird Tales sort of type of fantasy, right? He's not writing knights and castles. He's writing, back in the day, they used to think of Lovecraft as a fantasy writer, right? So he's writing fantasy that is fantasy the way like Stephen King writes fantasy, or the way that like Lovecraft wrote fantasy, right? It's weird suburban towns and supernatural sort of underpinnings, which isn't exactly the same thing as urban fantasy, because at this point urban fantasy is kind of like ossified into detective wizards and
Yeah.
like werewolf bodice rippers, and that's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing. And someone's going to yell at me for saying that. But this story, I think is really sort of clever, because it's about a guy who's kind of a wizard, right? But what he does is he deletes pesky verses from people's Bibles, right? That's his business, right? He's like, oh, that verse about adultery is inconvenient for you, no problem, I got you, right? And it's about these sort of like metaphysical consequences of messing with people's sort of sins and their convictions and things like that. And it's just, as with the rest of Power's work, it's really thoughtful and clever in a lot of ways. And he hasn't written a lot of fiction. I think he's written like maybe 24 short stories. He's mostly a novelist, right? But that is probably my favorite of all of his short stories, and it's in a book Bain actually collected, because we picked Tim Powers up when I was working there. He had been over with like William Morrow and stuff, but we brought him in because he wanted to come back into like a more pulpy sci-fi publisher, because that's really what the art is. And so we collected them all. And Down and Out in Purgatory is a collection of all of his short stories, and they're all kind of like off kilter and wacky like that. He's got kind of like a oh gosh, what's his name? Joe Lansdale kind of like weird fiction kind of vibe to him, and I think that story is awesome. So I really think people should check that one out, and that whole collection is worth reading.
And what was the name of the collection again?
Down and Out in Purgatory, which is also the name of one of the stories. So
okay, sweet, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. That's was Powers the one you were mentioning, that vampire novel?
Yeah, The Stress of Her Regard is my favorite vampire novel. And it's great. It's Lord Byron and the Shelleys and John Keats versus vampires.
That sounds awesome.
It's really great. Which, of course, it's how you'd get the inspiration for Polidori's Vampire, right? And for Frankenstein. And he does some really interesting stuff with vampires in that. One of the sort of through lines in Tim's work is that he will pick a sort of historical period and he'll research it until he can find basically a conspiracy theory that he can write a story about, right? In this case, it was vampires and the Austrian, emperor and stuff. So it was really cool. But that same sort of thread trickles down to his short stories. And so Down and Out in Purgatory, if you want to try a new writer, this is really a great way to get like the sample platter, right? Is to look and see if an author has a short story collection out there, because you'll get a sort of a vertical slice of what they're capable of, and Tim's one of the best. So.
No, I agree with that actually a lot. So that sounds like something I might have to do personally, because I don't have anything.
I think if you haven't read any Powers, I think you'd really like him. So.
I will. It'll be on the list of infinite number of things to read.
So. Yeah. Believe me, I know. Watch out the bookcases don't fall on you.
Right. Well, this one back here is like double stacked, and I'm always, and some shelves are like triples, so I'm just like, this is gonna just collapse one of these days.
One of these days, yeah, I'm right there with you.
So I need to get more shelves, but I don't know. It's partially laziness.
So. Yeah, the floor works fine. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, I don't want to take the time to organize these things. But funnily, the next one I have is I didn't mean to put them in this order. This is the most recent, probably. I thought I'd go with the older ones for sure first. But so we were talking about this action. I couldn't decide if I wanted to do one or the other, and I decided to go with one. Which is, of course, Power and Prestige by DJ Butler.
That's a good one.
So I really like Daybreak Tanichi too, of course. But this one, I don't know. It's just like, I also partially kind of wanted to get a sci-fi one. It's like kind of sci-fi. It's, like science fantasy, more so. But more fantasy even almost. But yeah. So Power and Prestige, I mean, I know Christopher knows this one. There's his name on this. But so, and this is actually this is Hadrian Babka even. So
Yeah,
some good Sun Eater art here. But this is a story that I just thought was like good from the first sentence to the last. It's rather short, but I mean I mean, you know, like the idea that you can open your like speech with a joke. I mean, that's basically what the story does. I mean, it's not really a joke so much, but it's funny and like because it's
yeah,
about it's far in the future, so there's like 1,000 like races of man basically, and one of them is dog like, and so like dogs, it has a tendency to they have the tendency to eat their feces or whatever, and so like that's the joke basically that it starts off with, and I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah. So Dave's a dear friend, obviously, and when I put together Sword and Planet, I knew I wanted him to write a story from his his science fantasy universe, right? He's got
Mhm.
this sort of Fafford and the Grey Mouser kind of buddy cop dynamic with that book, which he is working on the second one of.
Mhm.
I think he's actually finished it. I may be mistaken. But I was like, Dave, can you write a story for this? I get this story, and the first line is something like, "Just so you know, I might eat my own feces," right? And it is this dog person, right, that these two guys are trying to hire into their little mercenary outfit, basically. And Dave and I have this running joke that he has like this alter ego that's just Strange Dave, right? And Strange Dave does weird things like wear a badger skin hat to a restaurant because he has one and he has to wear a hat, so he may as well. Which instantly becomes uncomfortable as he then explains it to the waitress, right? And I'm sitting there like, I just wanted to eat food, Dave. Why are you doing this? And so the minute I started reading the stories, like, oh, Strange Dave wrote this one, right? It doesn't really let up, right? It just sort of takes that joke about this dog man and his dogness and kind of runs with it for the whole way. And it ended up being this really zany sort of outlier for the collection, because when you're putting the book together, you want a pretty good like mix, right? You want some dark stories, but if the whole collection is dark stories, like woof, like that's not going to be fun, right? So you want some different dynamics, you want some different tones, and that story has never been duplicated in tone. In the entire history of the 8 collections I put together, it is one of the more memorable ones. And Dave is such a great writer, right? His world building, his dialogue, his character work, it's just all really, really top notch. And I'm not saying that because he's my friend. He really is one of the best writers I know. And so that story is just it's something else, man. It's something else.
Yeah, man, I was like reading that, I was like, what just happened? Like like when I started, I was like, really? Okay. But I mean, that is like the first sentence in the story, and it's like, okay, Dave,
Yeah,
I'll go with it. I'll go with it. Like,
it, it's an exercise in trust, right? You're like, I don't know what I'm in for here, but like, okay, let's see where we're going. But it turns out to be this nice little murder mystery, right?
right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fun story. It's a weird world. He kind of like describes that setting as like if the Star Wars cantina were like the whole universe,
Hmm.
basically, and that's a pretty good sort of sense of what you're in for in terms of like texture, right?
Yeah,
It's just
definitely
fun.
got that weirdness to it, which I appreciate personally. But I also enjoy. I mean, not just appreciate because like, I mean, there is that first novel, and I think you're right. I think he's done with the second one.
I think it's done.
I know. I think was the third one going to have the short stories combined in it? Because as of right now, this is the only place you can get Power and Prestige.
That story. Yeah, I think that's the plan. I was planning on talking to him later today, actually. And so I will ask him. But I think that
Yeah.
that's the plan. Is there'll be a second novel, and then the third book's going to be. He's written at this point actually quite a number of stories with these characters.
Yes.
He's going to
Yeah.
collect them. And that might be. I think that might be it for now with those, because Dave's got like 8 series he's working on at any given point. So I'm not
Yeah. He's
quite
got
sure
to
what the
finish what
numbers
you were.
are.
I know that's
Yeah, he
in the
does.
plans. So.
Oh.
But I mean, I know it's not the one I recommended, but I do know if you want to get a feel for the Andragite and Fix, which is what these two characters are for Power and Prestige, the story Sacrifices is on Bane's website.
Oh
So
yeah,
that
yeah.
does give you somewhat of a feel for it as well. So
Yeah, and Bane's actually pretty great about that. They put out a free short story every month, but at the end of the year they collect it in ebook form. And if you go to Bane.com and you search like free fiction 2021, right, you can get the whole set, and that's for like years and years back. So if you just need some filler and you don't want to spend money, right, that's a great place to go and look. So um, yeah. The next story I wanted to mention is one that I think you just read, right? Which is Trip Trap by Gene Wolfe, which is, I
Yeah.
think, my favorite Gene Wolfe short story, which is um, saying both less and more than you think, because I've actually been rationing my Gene Wolfe supply because I'm not getting any more. And so I've only read about half a dozen Gene Wolfe short stories, but Trip Trap is one of his earlier works, and it is one of my favorite Gene Wolfe things, period. Like it kind of stands up there with some of the novels for me. Uh, and so it's about a sort of a Starfleet officer and about a an alien who is about equivalent to a medieval knight, right? And they team up to fight a troll that lives under a bridge, right? But that
Yes.
troll, it may or may not be an alien from an ancient alien civilization that has been long since forgotten. But what makes his story so damn cool and so stereotypically Gene Wolfe, who is, I think, some of the people watching will know is my favorite science fiction writer, is that it's written in close perspective from both the Starfleet officer and the knight, and it switches back and forth. And so all the Starfleet passages are describing the troll in the way that a Starfleet officer would describe this incident, and the knight is seeing it as this transcendent, sort of mythical, scary experience.
Yeah.
And the monster itself plays on their perceptions in really interesting ways. So it's a very subjective story, and it's so well handled, right? It's I think technically a novelette. It's not short,
Hmm.
but it has enough space to breathe and to really get into these characters and their cultures and their perspectives on this really like fairy tale kind of setup, right? And so it's doing a lot of stuff at the same time, which is usually the case even with Wolf's really short stories, right? He's able to do a lot more with 1,000 words than those 1,000 words should be able to do on their own. And it is, if you've never read any Gene Wolfe and you're not sure, you're intimidated by Book of the New Sun, read Trip Trap. It's like 10,000 words, which is like 40 pages. It's a really good sort of entry point if you're hesitant, right? And it's because it sort of typifies his more like postmodern kind of subjective writing style, and it's just an absolute blast. So
Yeah,
um,
I concur. No, I'm trying to
moving on.
remember what's the name of the collection that it's in.
I think that one is in endangered species. It's a white cover with like a yellow thing on it. It's very unclear what the thing is. I think it's in endangered species. It could be in Stories from the Old Hotel, which are the two collections that I
Here,
own.
I can actually check real quick because I have endangered species.
Well, there you go. I think it's in that one. But I got a bunch at once because originally when I was editing Sorted Planet, I was gonna make it a reprint book, and
Oh.
I decided to do original sort of last minute because frankly, getting original stories is easier on the editor than
Oh, okay.
stripping down old stories. And I was like, do I want to do this again? I just did. I just tracked down agents and authors' estates and the grandchildren of dead writers, and I would rather go easy on myself. So I was gonna run Trip Trap in Sorted Planet when it was a reprint story.
Oh man.
No.
Oh, talking to estates. I think I didn't actually see it here in Endangered Species, so it must be in the
Maybe
old
it's the
hotel
Stories
one.
from Old Hotel. Then
Yeah.
it's in one of the two.
Yeah. Oh man, I don't. That'd be so weird talking to estates. I don't know. That makes me think that'd be like
Yeah,
cool, but like an odd experience probably.
it's usually pretty cool, right? Especially if it is their family, right?
Hmm.
And not an agent, right? Agents are kind of a mixed bag. There are a couple that I really hate. Let's say, just be simple. But the families are usually delighted, right? I remember we worked with Lydia Van Vogt, A. Van Vogt's wife, right? And Hank had been trying to get a Van Vogt story in his short story collections for years and years, and we had the damnedest time tracking them down, which finally managed to get them for Time Troopers. And I can't remember the title of the story that we reprinted in that. But she was just lovely, right? She was, thrilled that anybody wanted to, still print her husband's work, these days. She's like in her 90s, right? It was just, it was cool. It was cool getting to do that. And, I did reprint a Gene Wolfe story in Time Troopers as well. We reprinted Against the Lafayette Escadrille, which is not really a military story. It's a little bit of a stretch, but it was, it was pretty recently after he'd passed away. And, very often agents are going to be authors, close friends, right? Especially if it's an older writer and they've worked together for a long time. And so it was cool to talk to his agent, right? And sort of, just share our, admiration for the late Gene Wolfe's work. And so that's neat, right? But there is a lot of detective work that goes into putting these books together. It's like, who the hell represents this person, right? Is it in public domain? I don't know. Do we want to print it anyway and see what happens? Every now and then someone will be unreasonable. They'll be like, actually, I want $2 billion for this 5-page story. And you're like, no, I'll use a different one. Bye. Right?
Jeez Louise. How about $2? I'll give you $2.
I have 300 tops, right?
$2 billion. Jeez Louise.
Not
I think of Rush Hour. Who do you think you are, Chelsea Clinton? But
there are a couple of people who they'll say stuff like that, or they want an exorbitant sum, or they'll it was just reprinted, or it's been reprinted too much. I don't want to print it again, which is perplexing to me. But
yeah, that's a lot. That's interesting. But I do.
Always a process.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess we can talk about that more maybe some other time. But don't get too distracted. Trip Trap, though, was a great story. I did read it just last week, actually. So I haven't read a lot of Wolf's short stories. Like the ones I can think of, like I've read The Cat and the Map.
Yeah, me too. Because they're New Sun, right?
Yeah, New Sun. Can't not read them. But Trip Trap was great. Like you said, it does. The ending was somewhat confusing, even which is not surprising, I don't think. But not like so confusing, where it's not bad. This is Gene Wolfe we're talking about, it's definitely interesting. It definitely reminded me. I think I mentioned it before. I had read Trip Trap that it reminded me, or it sounded like the idea, at least similar to King Dragon by Tom Shippey, which I should just email Tom Shippey and ask him if he had read Trip Trap, and that's where the idea came from. And then more people have probably read this one. It's recent. I think it came out just last year, I think, which is Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which says Trip Trap was the inspiration for the story.
I was about to ask, is that the one that he dedicated to Wolf?
Yeah, I think it was dedicated to him. So it mentions it at least at the beginning. So I was just like, okay, interesting. And so, and after reading Trip Trap, I was like, okay, I can definitely see the similarities here. I think personally, Wolf handles it better. Not trying to insult Tchaikovsky here. It's still a good story, but Trip Trap.
If you're up against Gene Wolfe, you're going to come in second place, in my opinion, right? I think in the opinion of a lot of people, right? He's one of the best of us, and I don't expect that to change, right? So
right, yeah. I don't think I'm insulting Adrian Tchaikovsky by saying Trip Trap is great, and you should go read it. So
I do want to read that book though, specifically because of Trip Trap. So, and I haven't read any Tchaikovsky, so it's something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, it does a very similar thing where there's someone who's basically from this spacefaring civilization, another one from not a spacefaring civilization, and different language for different point of view, basically. So kind of similar like that. It's not. I don't know. It's different. So, but it's still good. But Trip Trap is a good one. So, it was Tales from the Old. Is it Motel or Hotel? Is it
Hotel?
Motel. Okay. So.
Oh no, Hotel with an H.
Oh, Hotel. Okay. If you can find that, then I don't have a physical copy of that one. I read it on my Kindle app. So, which is a shame. I'll remedy that at some point here soon, probably. So, but.
I should have had my books on the table. I wasn't thinking that far ahead.
No, that's okay. I have a problem with having like anthologies, which is where a lot of these are anyways, just sitting out, like just in random places throughout the house. Like because I'll just like pick up one and read one story in it and put it down, and just like
Sure.
pick up another one or whatever. So
They
um
wander on. I get it.
so I didn't have to I didn't have to look too hard to find this. I didn't have to pull down like a layer on my bookshelf to look to the books behind them or anything like that because they were already out. So, um, which is just telling about what my bookshelves look like. My head is blocking the one behind me, which is probably good. But the next story I was thinking, one author we talked about, previously. This is Conan the Cimmerian. So this is the first collection of Conan the Cimmerian, Conan the Barbarian, if you want to call him that, I guess, stories. And I was specifically thinking Black Colossus, which I think is about halfway through this one. Not quite sure, actually. Let's see. Black Colossus. It is right after Queen of the Black Coast. So, or I don't know. These are more like novelettes, generally speaking, for Howard's Conan stories. And this one, the reason I like this one and wanted to use this one, I guess, over all the other great Howard stories, is because most of the story is not actually from Conan's point of view. When Conan goes flying into battle in the story and he's killing people, it is. But like for the most part, when he's like figuring out like how to, I think this is one of the ones where he's like in charge of an army, and so like figuring out how to survive, like you actually get the point of view from the princess's point of view, and I don't remember her name. But like so it's mostly her and like what she thinks when she sees this, towering, like swarthy brute, type of thing, like he's the iconic noble savage, like, right, that I personally. So like I can't think of a better one, at least in my opinion. So Black Colossus, I think, just showcases just the idea of Conan with all the goodness of Conan, like this weird, like dark evil, great battle sequences, but of course, it's pretty lady, put it that way. And so, but also it's not from his point of view most of the time, actually, in this one. And so you get like this cool, like, it's cool looking at Conan from the outside. So
On
it's
the
fun.
outside, yeah, and it's a change of pace too, right? Which is really neat. I actually have a Conan story too, as you know, because we anticipated that this would happen. Because of course, like Conan, if you want to read Conan, right, which is he's sort of like one of the few like old, like pre-Golden Age pulp characters that still gets read commonly, where you have to read short stories. There's only like one, I think Hour of the Dragon is the only thing that reaches technical novel length, right?
Yeah.
So you have to read them, right? And so he ends up being this weird throwback where if you want to read this story, which people do because he's, in the comics, there are video games, it's still around, right? You have to experience science fiction, fantasy, sword and sorcery in its sort of like original form, right? In these shorter formats. And so I, decided I was going to also have a Conan story anyway, right? For me, that's Tower of the Elephant, which is about Conan having to storm this fortress, right, and encountering this bizarre creature that lives in there. And it's hard to talk about without spoiling slightly, but it's an alien, right? And when you think about Conan the Barbarian, you don't think about him encountering aliens, right? But he does, and it's a study in the sort of porousness of genre distinctions back in the day, right? I talked about how like Lovecraft was thought of as a fantasy writer, right?
Yeah.
Nowadays, people think horror first, then science fiction. They don't think fantasy at all, right? But these are barriers that have been built up since, and that didn't exist early on, right? There's a lot of references to the Cthulhu mythos in Howard's work, right? And this creature, it's a very weird sort of like, it's almost, because it's sort of elephantine, right? I always think about the space jockey suit from Alien, right? With the sort of trunk. And it's got this very like Geiger Lovecraft feel to it. And it's not the sort of thing that you would expect Conan of Cimmeria to encounter with axe in hand, right? Although actually, usually more often a sword than an axe. But it's interesting because it's not a Conan story that has the big sort of like, knuckle dragging action climax, right? It showcases a different element of his character. And Conan, the literary character, is very different than the Arnold Schwarzenegger version, right? He's not an idiot, right? He's incredibly like direct and like unrefined. But those are virtues in Howard's conception, right? Those aren't faults. And like the first thing we ever see Conan do in Phoenix on the Sword, which is his first appearance, is lament that he has to kill a poet because poetry is tight, right? And that's not what people think Conan is at all. And so that's that initial appearance, but even this story, right, which in large way is about about Conan empathizing with this creature, right? Is not what people would expect, and it's people tend to give Howard short shrift, and they think he's also a knuckle dragging brute, right? And he's not sophisticated in any way. And this story, I think, gives the lie to that. I really think it's the best of all of his stories, all of Conan's stories, at least. And I strongly recommend that collection you have right there.
Yes,
because it's in the so.
Yeah, that one, I think it's before Black Colossus, but that is a really good one too.
Third in the book.
Yeah. It's right after the God in the Bowl. So, it is definitely a favorite. I'm still sticking with Black Colossus, but the God in the not the God in the Bowl, well, that one too. But the Tower of the Elephants is another really great one though, and I think you're right. Like it uses those cosmic elements, which were just done. I think it's pretty freaking cool, honestly. Like when it happens, and but it's also like it's Conan the Thief. It's also the youngest Conan I think we get, like as far as like actual Howard Conan and not the later pastiches.
Yeah.
And it's also a good example of him. Conan's not like a terrible guy. He's definitely, I guess, what we call a gray character. You know what I mean? But like this is definitely one of those things where he doesn't have to do what he does. If I'm remembering correctly, it's just like, I'm just going to go do that because I want to. And so that's a pretty typical sword and sorcery like type of idea. It's just like, I do what I want. You know what I mean? And it's not saving the world probably. So like,
yeah, I'm going on this quest because it's there, right? It's a Monday, right? What's Conan got to do? Nothing but breathe. So let's go, right? The motivations are usually on the shallow end, at least as far as a lot of modern readers would have it. But those sorts of people do exist, right? I'm gonna climb the mountain because it's there. I'm gonna scale this tower and meet an alien because why not, right? It's almost like Conan's playing an open world game, right? And just like, what's over here?
That's
boss.
That's a nice picture to put it into, I guess. That's Conan for you. He is in some ways. I think I was talking with Wrath Blue Tax earlier a few weeks ago when we were talking about that. Like Conan is basically, in some ways, kind of like Fafhrd and Grey Mouse. They're just your D&D party guys. They're just doing whatever the heck they want, So it's just...
Yeah, the story usually kind of starts in media res, right? And it's like, where are we now? Why are we here? Doesn't matter, right? We're here, so.
Yeah, I love it. And Howard definitely helped me fall in love with like the idea of sword and sorcery and stuff like that. So, but definitely,
yeah, and you can tell a story in 10,000 words that has the same scope as a novel that's 10 times as long. Now, obviously, he has to skate over a lot of stuff, but like Black Colossus and Red, what is it? It's a very similar story. Red, damn it.
I think I know what you're here.
Yeah,
is that in this one too? I think it is.
It's in the same book. I can't remember. Red something. They're both like full on like Clash of Empires, giant struggle, military sort of fantasy stories, and they're way shorter than novel length, but they don't feel smaller. And that's really a lost art, I think, in writing, in part because we've moved away from short stories so entirely. There are not a lot of writers working today, myself really included, who could do as much in as short a space. And
I know it's impressive. You really should, honestly. This Del Rey collection is not too pricey. It's in print, I think, still. So I mean, like, go pick this bad boy up. It has both of the stories you recommended by Howard. So, I mean.
Yeah, yeah, and there are other, remixes, right? People will put the stories together in a slightly different order, and as long as it's the Howard stuff, it's worth getting. It doesn't matter which version you folks pick up. I'd be a little more hesitant of like the Lynn Carter, Sprague de Camp, and the Robert Jordan
Yeah.
stuff. That's
Oh,
way
yeah.
more empathetic.
Definitely on the latter ones there.
Yeah,
But, I read a Robert Jordan pastiche Conan, actually, Conan the Invincible, and it's actually takes place right after the Tower of the Elephant. Um, I can't really recommend it as highly though. But yeah. Anyways, we have this thing. I think Christopher, you and I have this problem where we can probably talk about this for hours. But so, like,
oh yeah, 100%. But that's okay.
yeah, right. It is.
I guess we should move on.
We should probably, yeah. So
Yeah.
the next one I have is definitely. So I wasn't similar to. We both didn't mention this yet, but we were trying to limit our short story selections to just one per author, and I was trying to do the same with Forgotten Realms. Like I just do one Forgotten Realms story. It didn't work. I'm going to mention another Forgotten Realms story. But this is a great one, I think, partially because before I even tell you what it's about, it's set. I'm not even sure where it is in this. It's in an anthology called Realms of War. I think this is the only place you can read it. I'm not quite sure. It's edited by Philip Athens. He's the guy who wrote the Baldur's Gate novels. Actually, he's written like StarCraft novels and other things too, I think. But I'm not quite sure on that actually. But yeah, other stuff. But this story itself is by Bruce R. Cordell, but it takes place like hundreds of years before most of the Forgotten Realms stuff, and it's in a city that's not really important, in a country that's not really important. So it's like you don't have to know anything like to go and read this. Like I know there's a lot of people are intimidated by Forgotten Realms because there's like almost 300 novels, so rightly so that to be intimidated. But like you really don't have to know anything for this one. So if you find Realms of War, and then the story is Black Arrow by Bruce R. Cordell. It's on 89. It says here. So it is. I haven't read a lot of stories like this, but I can say that it opens with a letter. You can kind of see it here. And it's a letter written to this character's mom saying like, thanks for your son's sacrifice, basically. Like he helped save the city. Like, that's the whole point is war, right? The anthology, and so the city's getting attacked by a horde of like goblinoids, basically. And so he dies. Like it just tells you that straight up in the first page that he dies, and then the next page he's the main character. So the whole story, this young kid who's like naive, eager for adventure, but to be good and to do good, and he ends up doing like awesome stuff, and then at the end he's gonna die, and like I cried reading this. Like this is probably my favorite short story I've ever read, which is weird because Bruce R. Cordell is just a D&D designer. Like for the most part. So like really, really great. Like and rather short, just great fantasy short story, honestly. It's a favorite. Well, I would just honestly I could probably just say it's my favorite. Like compared to everyone else, like even though I love short stories, it's probably my favorite one. So I don't think I've ever cried in a short story.
That's a neat little framing device, and it's I think too indicative of the sort of thing that you could pull off in a short story that better perhaps than you can in a novel, because people tend to not be super thrilled about novels that give away the ending. Right, this is a consistent thread of criticism I get for having written a 7 book long memoir. We know the ending already, which is not strictly true, but it's a really long way to go with knowing some things in advance, right? And so you can get away with that sort of thing in 3,000 words a lot more easily. It's almost like short stories are like they have maybe more in common with paintings than novels do, because like you can kind of take them all in at a glance in the same way that you can looking at a painting.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get away with a little bit more experimentation, I think, than asking someone to keep up with an experiment for 500 pages is different than like 5, right, or 10, and so that's really cool. I want to check that one out.
Yeah, highly recommend. Really good, and that's an interesting comparison to like painting or whatever. It reminds me of when I was talking with Ed Greenwood, probably about a month ago now, and he mentioned like we were talking about short stories a little bit, and he mentioned like you can make them really short, and you just like he mentioned the story. I don't remember who wrote it, right, but it's basically like The Last Man Alive, he's just sitting there, and then he hears a knock at the door, right? And that's the whole short story, right? And so it's just like, and right, that's cool. Yeah, and that's literally at a glance, basically. That takes 10 seconds to read. So I mean, like, so
and it sticks with you, right? Which is harder to do, I think, with more and more volume, right? You can't quite land the same blow as heavily and as quickly as you can with the shorter piece, which is really neat. So the next story I wanted to talk about is a classic, and I felt like I should get a couple sort of all-time gold standard classics of the genre on the list. So I've got two. This is Robert Heinlein's All You Zombies, which is probably one of the most famous sort of time travel puzzle stories of all time. I can almost not tell you anything about it without spoiling something, because it has one of the more famous twists in a short story in science fiction history. Its basic setup is, a guy walks into a bar, right? But there is a lot more going on, and it's one we reprinted actually in Time Troopers. Hank and I. It's not really a military story either, but like if we didn't put it in there, it would have been a mistake, because it's such a famous story. They actually made it into a movie called Predestination with Ethan Hawke. It came out a few years ago. It was actually pretty good. Short stories I tend to find actually make better, grounds for adaptation, because there's actually a little room for the filmmaker to kind of stretch things. There's a Philip K. Dick story called Imposter that also made a pretty good movie with Gary Sinise, which is one of my favorite PKD stories. And so I'll sort of mention that as a bonus while we're on the subject. But that's another one that I think made the jump pretty well. But with All You Zombies, it's like I said, it's kind of a puzzle story, and because of that, it's so tightly written. Right, the idea is like really really cool. Once the twist hits and things start to gel, you realize it's as famous as it is for a reason. And it's one of those that's been reprinted a billion times. I'm sure a lot of the folks watching will have read this one before and know what the twist is. But while I usually have no compunction about spoiling things, if I just tell you, right, there's no point in reading it because it is just a short little story, right? So go check it out. It's a legend for a reason, and probably my favorite little Heinlein piece. He's not my favorite writer by any means, but this is a great story. Worth reading for sure.
I'll have to check that one out. My little brother has actually started recently reading Heinlein, and he's one of the greats, of course, that I haven't read yet. Which the list is still rather long. It's quite sad, but that'll change, over time. But now I'm just looking at Time Troopers, thinking I'll have to go read that one because that sounds really interesting, actually.
Yeah, so. It's really cool. The short story is one of those places where if you have a really good idea for a twist, and that's the only idea you have about the story, make it a short story, right? Don't make a novel about the one little twist you've got. So in talking about the sort of painterly nature of these things, you've got that idea and you want to make it land. Like short story is the perfect theater for it. And Heinlein was really, really good at this. His short fiction is, I think, on balance stronger than his novels. How I feel about Asimov too, right? I think the short fiction is usually more impactful. And so well worth checking out if you can find a collection of his stories.
Interesting. Okay, I have one Heinlein book actually, and I don't remember what it's called. It's in terrible shape. It was this guy had passed away, and these people had wanted me to help come clean out his house. They had bought it, with everything in it, and so I took the good books because they let me. So I'm like,
there you go. Yeah, that's how you do it.
So but I'll have to definitely check that out. It's funny, you're I think the second person I've ever heard say painterly, by the way. So
well, it's an elite list.
So. Oh yes, yeah. The other one on the list is my brother. So
no.
But he uses it when he's teaching class. So but anyways, the next story I wanted to share. This is terribly hard, and I mentioned to you a couple times actually because it's a Liber story, and because I couldn't not mention a Liber personally, so this is it's funny. I just realized I grabbed the wrong Liber book, but I was like, I'm sitting here holding swords in the mist. I was like, wait a second, this is not Swords Against Wizardry, but it's in Swords Against Wizardry, which is back there somewhere. Which is the fourth, I guess, if you doing like the tiny little volumes of like Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. I have these old those Ace little paperbacks. You can get them in omnibuses, but anyway, Swords Against Wizardry has 4 stories in it. 2 are actually like novelettes; they're quite long, and then the other 2 are considerably shorter. And this is one of the short ones. It is the 2 Best Thieves in Lankhmar, and it's so hard to choose. It's so hard to choose. At Fritz Leiber, especially a Fafhrd and Grey Mouser short story, personally. But I wanted to go with 2 Best Thieves in Lankhmar just because it's got such an interesting twist. I feel like because I mean, well, if you ever read, okay, how do I say this? If you haven't read Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, it doesn't really matter so much what order you read it in. Not really. I mean, I've heard people recommend books 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Doesn't matter, just pick one. And I've heard there are books 6 and 7, but I guess people don't like starting with those so much. But anyways, so 2 Best Thieves in Lankhmar is basically from the previous story, Stardock, though. They had gotten some gems from this adventure of theirs, and they go back to Lankhmar to sell them. That's basically the premise of the story. Now, if you don't know Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, they're actually just big buffoons. I mean, like, they're like the badass, like, swordsman of the entire planet, which he actually insinuates is kind of actually like a sphere thing, but not like a circle, like a flat thing with a bubble on top. It's kind of what he insinuates it actually looks like. But they're basically the best swordsmen in the world, but they're also idiots. So like they're gonna go sell their gems, but they decide they're gonna do it separately. So like Fafhr's gonna go sell his gems, and the Grey Mouser is gonna go sell his gems to someone else, and they're just idiots. The whole story is just them. It's just highlighting how stupid they can be. And so, are they the 2 Best Thieves in Lankhmar? You have to read the story and find out. This one definitely also has some of that like interesting sexual stuff that Leiber is just open about. You know what I mean? Like, and it's not like gross in this story at all, or by any means. Just like interesting that he was writing about it in the 60s. So that's just the one I wanted to recommend this time.
Yeah, well, he's an original, that's for sure. It's interesting that you point out the reading order thing, because it's true of Conan too, right? And that's just sort of true of a lot of the older, sort of serialized characters, right? Like you don't have to read Sherlock Holmes in order. Like, sure, studying Scarlet's first, but this is not a time when people could look up reading order on Wikipedia, right? And so, like, it behooved you as the writer to sort of like make everything kind of stand alone. If someone's keeping up with you, like, awesome. But like a huge reason why like series didn't become 20 books until the last couple decades is because like how the heck are you keeping up with that in
Right.
it's so the series keep getting longer and more articulated, and it's just not the case if you read stuff from the 60s. It's just not. So the last story though that I had on my list is another very famous one, and that is The Last Question by Isaac Asimov. Right, it's a very famous story. As are pretty much all of Asimov's stories. Like I said, I think he's stronger in short fiction than he is in novels, because he's a big ideas guy, right? This is sort of his reputation. Like, Asimov has like all these cool ideas, right? But like a lot of people say, his characters don't hold up, right? The prose isn't that great, right? And this one's always, and that's not me, right? That's like other people are saying that.
But yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah, and while I'm with you, I prefer the sort of like earlier, like Lovecraft, Howard, Sword and Sorcery kind of, weird fiction vein and all this. The Golden Age has some real gems to it, and this is my favorite Asimov story. And it is about a computer, right, in the near future, right, that overhears a couple of scientists asking if they think the second law of thermodynamics could ever be, overcome, right? The entropy problem, right? And the computer like relegates processing this to the back of its mind, right, indefinitely, and it just thinks about this as it continues to be bootstrapped into a more and more sophisticated, software system over the course of the next millions of years, right? until that question becomes more and more pressing as the universe is starting to wind down and go dark, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just that sort of continuity is really interesting, and the fact that it's a story about the problem, right, in such this typical like Asimovian way, and it all leads to this little twist right at the end, right? Same way with the last story. It has this very famous ending, and it really struck me when I read. I think I read it in ninth grade because I had a science fiction class in high school. I went to a magnet school, and so I was able to take a literature course on science fiction, which was a real
Nice.
a real privilege. That's why my tastes run older too, is because my teacher was an old fan from the '60s, right? So he grew up reading this stuff, right? He grew up reading the pulps. He grew up reading the Golden Age stuff, and not like I have a huge like '70s, '80s, '90s shaped hole in my science fiction reading. It's like really old stuff and like today. And of course, like Lord of the Rings or whatever, right? Of course, it's the '50s, but it's a special case. And it really, really, the ending has always sort of sat with me in the same way that the idea sat with the computer, right? And it's just been something that I think about a lot, and something that's informed my work to a degree. And it's an influence that I've never really talked about, but it's had a profound influence on my writing and on the Sun Eater actually in sort of overarching ways. And so it wouldn't be I would be remiss not to mention it. So it's great, and it's in a billion different Asimov collections. It's probably one of his top 10 most referenced, most reprinted stories. It's right up there with
I'd imagine.
some of the robot stuff, and yeah. So
Yeah. This is one I actually read, but forever ago. Like forever ago. Like maybe middle school.
yeah, it was a long time for me too. I don't think I've read it since. But it's very it's not complicated. It doesn't need to
Mhm.
be. But it does it ends on this wonderfully, sort of evocative note.
Mhm.
And for a guy who wasn't talking around the thing, right? For a guy who wasn't religious, right? It really goes to an interesting place.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I feel like that happens in well, actually, I would just say happens in sci-fi more than it happens in fantasy sometimes. But and
I think
definitely
that's right.
interesting. So I also think, I guess maybe there's I don't think there's a problem with like escapism and just having like the whatever you write or whatever you read just be for entertainment purposes. But it's nice when there's a thought as well,
Yeah, it
not just
helps.
thought put in by the author, but thought that it can make you think really. So or just blow your mind or something, or just like, what the heck did I just read or something. So I like that. I always appreciate that. So, but actually, so I have one more story. I can't believe I grabbed the wrong library book. That's hilarious. But I have one more story actually to share, and this is one I read earlier this year. That is, my copy doesn't have the dust jacket. I'm quite sad. Um, I'll have to get another copy at some point. But it's Jarell Joiry by C.L. Moore. Um, the story is Hell's Guard. So this has not a lot of stories in it. It's like 5 or 6 or something. Maybe 7. I'm not quite sure. There's some versions that have the one story she wrote with is it Henry Kuttner, her
Yeah,
husband?
Governor.
That it's like a crossover between his, what's his name, Southwest, I think, or something like that, or Northwest. Is that it? I don't
Northwest
know.
Smith is that's Lee Brackett's character, isn't it?
Is it? I'm pretty sure that I swear that this story I read in
Yeah,
this.
you might be right. I might be mistaken. It's been a long time since I read that stuff. That was like again ninth grade. So
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny. I have a Kuttner book right next to my bracket books, and they're just all like 50s aces that are like shorter than later mass market paperbacks. I'm pretty sure it's this Northwest guy, Smith or whatever. I think it's Kuttner's character. Maybe Brackett used him as well. I don't know.
yeah, that could be. We could both be right.
Yeah. So that one's in this, but that's not the one I want to talk about, obviously. So Hellsguard, though, is interesting. The reason I kind of want to mention it is because she's one of the earlier female fantasy authors. CL stands for Catherine Lucille. This is pulp. Like these stories are coming out. I think in the last couple of years of Howard's life, and so also when like Lovecraft was writing and stuff too. She's not nearly as popular and some would probably say she's not nearly as good. And like, but I
I
think
wouldn't say that. I
Hellsguard.
think she's awesome.
I think Hellsguard is amazing, personally, and I think Jarell as a character is just badass in like the coolest ways. So she also has yellow eyes, which is just cool. You know, like it's not just new things for fantasy characters to make their protagonists just like look not, you know, like have characteristics that you can't actually have and like can't happen in real life. So yellow eyes, you know, pretty cool. She's got fiery red hair too. But that can't happen, I guess. But so she's it's like fictional France. That's basically what Joari is. And but it's sword and sorcery. It's like this weird medieval, like Christ is mentioned, for example, in some of these stories. The Hellsguard is cool because it has like one of the coolest, I think, monsters in any fantasy I've ever read, and it's like this weird reverse vampire type of thing going on. I don't want to spoil it too much for anyone. Just you can go read it. It has a lot of gothic horror elements in this one, rather than the more cosmic that most of the other Jarell stories have. But it's basically Jarell is like she has to go save her men by retrieving some artifact from this, like, I think it might be, it must be a castle, Telsgard, and so it's called. So she can come back and give it to this guy, and her men will be free. Basically, that's the premise of the story. But it's pretty freaking wild, actually. So since it was written, that was, I think, the last Jarell Joari story written. I think it's like in 38 or something, maybe 39. It holds up pretty sneaking well. I mean, I know when some people ask for like female main characters or female authors, I'll recommend C.L. Moore and Jarell Joari. Very underrated, just to say. So
yeah, she and Lee Brackett both are supremely overlooked, right? You know, modern readers don't even know they're around, right? Lee Brackett wrote the original draft of Empire Strikes Back, right?
Yeah.
Or Lawrence Kasdan came in and made Darth Vader Luke's father, you know, and she was a huge deal, right? Throughout the 50s, stuff with like Eric John Stark, right? That whole series, which is like, you know, John Carter, but for Mercury instead, right? And it's those are fun. Those are just fun stories, books. And I just looked too. You were right. Northwest Smith is C.L. Moore, but Brackett did write in that setting sometimes too.
That's interesting. Wow, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. I think we reprinted a Brackett story that had Smith in it. And so maybe that's where I'm getting confused, or it's just a bad memory. So I don't know. But they were neat, right? Because they had this whole shared setting, and that's something that we think of as being a pretty modern innovation in you know, in storytelling, and it's really, really not, right? It goes all the way back. You know, Lovecraft and Howard sort of, you know, alluded to one another's worlds in their own writing, but this was like an outright shared universe that these writers were working in, and yeah, so I would strongly recommend anybody go check out C.L. Moore, Lee Brackett, Kuttner, you know, the bunch. Really, they're just all worth reading.
Right. Yeah. I do plan on reading The Dark World by Kuttner soon, which is apparently a big influence on Zelazny's Amber. So I'm looking forward to that one. You know, Clark Ashton Smith was actually one I almost shared the story for here, and he definitely has like that shared, like, he basically shared the Cthulhu mythos with Lovecraft. Like a lot of those guys are Smith creations, like Sathagua and others. So
yeah, a lot of them are. You know, it's interesting. Who was I reading? My friend David West wrote a story for my last Bane Books anthology, and he did the same kind of thing at the beginning, where the character in this science fiction story is mentioning reading all the classics, right? Like Lord of the Rings, like whatever, and he starts listing a bunch of things that I didn't hear from, and I'm sure that those are stories his friends are writing, and that's such a like very like, you know, 30s pulp move, right? You know, you've got characters in Lovecraft stories who will, like, you know, in passing refer to books by Smith, or I think in Mountains of Madness he name checks Clark Ashton Smith, like by name, right? He's like, this thing looked like something out of a Clark Ashton Smith painting, right? And like nobody reading that, you know, I guess they were reading Weird Tales, so they would know from Weird Tales, but that's like the only place they would know from, right? And it's just really cool. This little one of the things about Lovecraft, right, that he never gets credit for anymore is he's like the most prolific letter writer in human history, right?
That's
or at
wild.
least in the English language. I think he wrote like 100,000 like letters or something like
Oh my
that.
god.
He basically built, fandom, right, by networking all of these Weird Tales writers together and like kind of making a community in the first place. And that sort of helped build like the mythos, right? The Cthulhu mythos is sort of this weird shared project that kind of grew up and sort of built what we now know of in a lot of ways as the genre, right? As fandom with a capital F and all of that. And it's reflected in the writing, and so it often is really rewarding to go in and look at these old stories and dig deeper. I wanted to do a Smith story too, but I hadn't read them in a long time, and I didn't feel like I could pick one. But I will at least say that if people have read all of Lovecraft and they want more, go read Clark Ashton Smith. Right?
Yeah. There's a quote from Lovecraft saying that Smith is the best cosmic horror writer. So, which is I mean, obviously, right? Maybe it's some nepotism going on, but it's also high praise considering cosmic horror is also called Lovecraftian horror, right? So,
Yeah, and considering what a snob Howard was, right? HP that is.
yeah,
For him to praise somebody is pretty meaningful. So, it's
yeah.
yeah.
I think the last poem I shared is actually is called To Clark Ashton, but it's like Clark Ash dash Ton, Lord of Averone, inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. But Averone is Smith's setting, or one of the many he did. But yeah, so I almost shared some Smith stories. But it's funny that you mentioned that like pulp like shared world thing though, because I did finish Our Lady of Darkness by Library earlier and just like a couple days ago, and it was written in the late '70s. But it's funny because he mentions it's got this huge amount of like metafiction thing going on here, and it's just like he mentions a bunch of Lovecraft. He mentions like Poe, Jack London, I mean Ambrose Bierce, just a bunch of different authors, and he mentions that like one of the characters in the book is Clark Ashton Smith by the way of a notebook, and Leiber knew Clark Ashton Smith. You know what I mean? And also there's it's funny, I think actually he references a Liber story in the story. And I was like, dude, you just referenced yourself. What the heck was that? So which I thought was hilarious. But like in the story himself, it's supposed to be like kind of him anyways. The main character's name is Franz, rather than Fritz. And he's struggling with alcohol and being a widower, and this was written after Fritz had lost his wife and was struggling with alcohol, and so it's just like, it's really interesting. It's a really good book, but it's too long to be put on this list anyways. But
well, in the interest of putting a bow on it too, the epigraph in The Stress of Her Regard, actually the title Stress of Her Regard, Tim Powers' book, comes from a Clark Ashton Smith poem. And the book opens with one of Ashton Smith's poems, right? So and so it's all sort of, now the whole video fits together, Liam.
That's great. Yes, it does.
Put a bow on it.
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think even as much as I like Clark Ashton Smith's short stories, he's a great poet in my opinion. I love his poetry actually. So.
Yeah, it's really he's really imagistic anyway, and so in the poetry that really gets to shine through.
But we'll keep it there, I guess, before we go any longer. But hopefully, whoever's watching this enjoyed it. Hopefully, you got some short stories you can add to your list, especially, if you don't read many short stories, maybe you can get into short stories through reading one of these. But thanks again, Christopher, for coming on with me. It's been fun.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. This is a great idea. So
yeah, well, I'm not full of great ideas, so I have to use them when I get them. So, but yeah, thanks. Anyways, everyone, we'll catch you next time. So,
thanks for having me.